Good morning, folks. Thank you for coming. It's just going to be me today. Vicky's on vacation. And today we're going to give you an update about what's going on in the national and state economy and try to make some sense of what's going on in terms of the current forecast. Things are looking pretty good, just to give away a little bit of the final stage here. But I want to thank Chabin and Kaiser Marston for continuing to support these. And we're going to do it a little bit different today. If you've seen this before, we're not going to have as much animation today because I'm only on one screen today. But let's get started right away with what's going on in the macroeconomy. This is the latest data coming out of the US, and I'm going to try to describe this to you relatively easily. The gray area are temporarily lost workers in the US, and you can see that spike on the far right-hand side, that gray increase in the number of unemployed workers, and then it becomes more colored. If you look back toward the left-hand side of the graph, these data are from January 2007 forward, and you can see the hills that were generated because of the Great Recession and how those faded over the last decade. Well, the spiking in unemployment on the far right-hand side of the graph was originally a function of people temporarily losing their jobs and then starting to lose them in other ways, which included permanent losses, the blue. The completed temporary jobs now are looking for other work, which is the next, which is sort of the orange color. They left their job or they quit, which is the yellowish color. The lighter blue is folks that were re-entering the labor force, and a lot of those are single parents who had to stay home in some cases because of childcare issues and school being closed physically. And then finally, we have new entrants into the workforce. The reason why this graph is important, and I show it, is because on the far right-hand side, the number of people unemployed, while dropping from the original heights, has now become a little bit more heterogeneous in such a way that it looks more like normal recession. So one of the things that economists are concerned about at the national level is whether or not we can get all those to fade simultaneously, because certainly temporarily unemployed people have faded, but have they been converted to permanently unemployed is one of the biggest questions going forward. Now, this is a look at continued claims for unemployment insurance, and now that we're starting to see some of the original recession concerns fade, one of the things we're starting to watch a little less closely are the new claimants for unemployment insurance. But I think it's also important to look not only at the recent history. These data are from the beginning of January 2020 to about 2 weeks ago. You can see that it's been on a pretty nice, slow, flat trajectory for a while, but the problem is it's not dropping. So going back to the graph I just showed you, if you think about the number of people who are permanently unemployed and the growth of that over the last 6 months, part of that is a trade-off here in these claimants for unemployment insurance, that you're getting people to come off of unemployment at both the US and California level. So this shows you both. The blue is the US using the left-hand axis, the black is California using the right-hand axis, and both have faded. But the fact that it's been stable for this long over that, let's say 2 or 3 months, suggests that we're starting to get some, what you can think of as structural stagnation inside the unemployment ranks. We will see how the next 8 or 9 months go. If we start to travel more, if we start to see people come back to restaurants more, you're probably going to see that fade relatively quickly. But it's something we're just sort of watching in the background because it corroborates the data and, in a sense, forecasts the data we just saw in the last graph. This is an update of the industry level changes in jobs. And I'm now saying changes in jobs rather than reduction in jobs, because we're starting to see a little bit more positivity across the United States and also in California in terms of industries coming back. But the key is this. These are the job changes from February 2021, looking back to February 2020, and also for April, December, and January from 2020 and 2021, looking backward. Now, what's the point here? April was where most of the damage happened. So in April 2020, that was the initial fall, and you can see those blue columns are very sharp downturns from the red dotted line, which is 0. So that means there's negative change from the previous year in terms of the number of people employed in each one of those industries across the board. Then we saw recovery momentum. And in February, we saw it start to slowly kick back after December and January were a little bit stagnant. But the point is, on the far right-hand side, we still have some serious problems in bars and restaurants and hotels. Again, wrapped up around travel and the way that we eat out and the way that we engage in restaurant services generally, which is, of course, tied to travel. So things here look a little bit desperate in those industries, and certainly a lot of the people who are unemployed are in those industries. But there's still some other industries with relatively strong changes in unemployment. For example, educational services. Educational services, generally, when stated like this, is made up primarily of local education, meaning local government education, or what you can think of as our normal school districts, but also private education. So being about 10% down in February means that we're starting to see some cutbacks in teachers, and whether or not those kick back up once we start to go back to school in earnest is something to watch. But generally speaking, we've seen momentum for recovery across the board, across all industries in the United States. One way that I've been trying to showcase the way that we're starting to recover is this graph, where not only does this show the Great Recession's initial downturn, and then it's coming back up over about 78 months back to full recovery, but also where we've been in the COVID-19 journey, if you will. We're about 94% home. That's what that 94.0% number means. We're 94% back to the dotted line, which is where we started January 2020, and we need to get that black line back up to the red dotted line. The key is, as you can see, we had a sharp downturn, then pretty decent momentum going into the fall, and then a relative flat movement over the last 4 or 5 months in terms of getting people back to work. So juxtaposed to unemployment, this is really a showcase of a number of people we have employed, and the shifting labor force is really the next piece to watch in terms of people retiring, and in the case of California, people leaving certain areas. But this shows that we're at least on the road to recovery, and everything looks pretty good right now at the national level otherwise in terms of the comeback of jobs. When you look at California, and what I'm showing you here is I'm showing you the state, which is in the far left-hand side, those second and third columns from the left, and then the major metropolitan areas of California. You'll see that the unemployment rate is relatively low for every place but the Los Angeles area. And Los Angeles is still sort of, really under the grip of a lack of travel, a lack of full comeback of the entertainment industry, a lack of full comeback of schools, and still around 11% unemployment. But if you look up one row to where it says civilian employment, you'll notice the percentage changes there are a little different for some places. So for example, in San Francisco, the unemployment rate is 5.5%, but the number of people who are not working as of with respect to 1 year ago is down almost 11%. And that's because that next row up, the labor force, is down 7.4%. So notice that for San Francisco, that one is the largest change of all those labor force numbers. And the reason behind that is because people have left San Francisco. And I'll talk more about that at the very end. But it's a very intriguing time in terms of watching labor market statistics and trying to think about jobs come back, because it's very hard to know when you see the unemployment numbers how much they're really tied to the local area's economy and more tied to how people have either got a job or not come back, and then also the shifting labor force and where people are living. But in places like San Diego and Sacramento, things are starting to recover very, very well and very, very quickly, which is great news. Similar picture for California, about 93.1% home. That black line needs to go back up to the red dotted line, just like we saw a couple graphs ago. But a much more choppy recovery, which is, reflective of how we had relatively choppy social policy, meaning that at one time we looked like we're going to more completely open up, then we stopped, then we did it again, and we sort of been going with the waves of coronavirus cases. But that sharp increase in February suggests that we are now, as we start to open up more and more, going to continue to propel up toward that red dotted line we will see. The blue line, just like in the last or a couple graphs ago when I showed you the US, same deal, a little faster recovery in the Great Recession, but a little bit more classic bowl-shaped movement. This has been a lot more choppy by the nature of how the COVID-19 recession has unfolded. But good stuff, and that black line pointing up toward the red is a good sign. Here's continued claims for unemployment insurance across California. The black dotted line is the US, and you can see how sharply that has fallen. But for most of the major MSAs in California, the trend line is moving down. The last couple of months have been a little on the tricky side. This is through the end of February, starting in January 2019. And you can see not much happened in 2019. All kinds of stuff happened in 2020. And hopefully we're going to see all those lines start to point down over the summer. The key, though, is that, again, just like when we looked up at the US and California compared to each other, these data are somewhat mixed up with this movement of temporarily to permanently unemployed, and also movements of labor force. So at the US and California level, the labor force thing is less of an issue generally. At the local level, somebody moving from Fresno to Sacramento and is claiming unemployment insurance will then move that claim from Fresno to Sacramento. So the numbers can move around as people are moving around a little bit, which can make it a little tricky and a little choppy. But if all these are pointed down, all is good. Now, One of the bright lights in this recession has been we have not seen an equity market sell-off like we saw in the Great Recession. So housing markets and equity markets have held relatively firm, if not grown relatively strongly over the last 12 months, depending on what housing market you're looking at. But this is California across all 58 counties. California's in black on the column there. This is the forecast looking forward 12 months. So we've had a really good 12 months previous to February 2021. The outlook looks really strong, which is great, with two caveats. One is that if you notice the geography of these changes, on the far right-hand side, a lot of the Bay Area is boiled into a slower forecast. So one of the things that we have is we sort of have these pockets of growth throughout California. And one of the things, if you've been watching these throughout the time that Chabin and Kaiser Marston has been supporting these, or have been supporting these, one of the things I talked about early was maybe this sort of movement from the urban areas to the rural areas. And in fact, most housing economists have forecasted that exact outcome, with the idea that you should see a little bit more movement toward our rural areas and a little less demand in the urban. And that's been true for the Bay Area, but not necessarily across all of urban California. Even Los Angeles has a relatively decent forecast. Los Angeles is about in the middle of this forecast, with relatively strong unemployment and a need to see strong recovery to really get back the reasons to stay in LA, especially if you're a low to middle income worker. But the key, and this is the second caveat, is that for the most part, high income workers and interest rates, or high income earners keeping their jobs and interest rates being relatively low, have propelled most of the demand forecasts. So this is not really involving low to middle income workers in California. So we're not really concerned that much in terms of the housing forecast with the shifts, but what we are concerned about is social policy later. And we'll be talking about a housing crisis again, folks, in a couple of years. So in these talks, I have normally talked about a special item that has to either do with workforce development or economic development. And what I'm going to talk about today are some migration statistics. So one of the things that economists have tried to do over the last few months is really try to put our grips around, can we get any real-time data that suggests this is why this is how the labor force is moving around. We know the labor force has shifted around California. We saw that in the data a few slides ago. But is there some way of really getting a hold of that? Well, you may have been reading in the paper that people are leaving California in droves. Well, the droves is a little maybe overstated, but these data basically show that. These are from the US Postal Service, which unfortunately I did not source here. The net number of households that have moved from California. So one of the things that you want to watch out for is when you think about people leaving California, where are they going to? And remember, it's a net number. We know that people are coming to California also. So within those data, people are going to places like Arizona, Colorado, Florida, Nevada, classic, New York, Oregon, Texas, Washington, all classic places where people are going from California when they leave California. The critical factor is the amount of households that are changing, but there's also people coming in. They're coming in, guess what, from Arizona, Florida, New York, Oregon, Texas, Washington, Nevada, similar places. So when you think about the net movement, one of the factors that we see in these data is, and it's really just a toehold on the movement of people, is what types of households are we gaining and what types of households are we losing? Because from an economic and workforce development standpoint, especially in local areas, and we're going to see local areas in just a second around California, one of the things that's critical is the recognition that how we trade off labor force participants is one of the biggest concerns. People moving is not as big a concern. We know that California is a high cost of living state. It's probably going to be a higher tax state relatively soon. One of the things that has been tricky also is it has a relatively high unemployment rate if you look around the United States. So the job prospects may be, at least for lower middle income workers, not as strong as other places around the United States. So recession comes with migration. It's part of the gig. But are we trading off folks that are coming with working families, or are we trading off folks that are coming as retirees with wealth, and we're not going to have the same amount of workers here? That's key. This is the number of households, not the number of people. Well, when we look at the next graph, this actually breaks it down by county. And this is the net change just in the year 2020. And if you look to the left, you're going to see a lot of rural areas. So most of the places in California that had net increase in the number of new households were rural places. And by the nature of how this recession unfolded, and by the nature of from the socio-political aspects of how it unfolded, we expected that. If you looked at the far right-hand side, and I show you San Francisco on the far right-hand side, that negative 56.6% means that there was 56.6% of the people or the households that were changing where they were living was leaving San Francisco, meaning that there was a lot more people, or a lot more households leaving the city than coming into the city. And you can see how dominant that number is in terms of the net change in households across all the counties of California here. And California had net negative, but was relatively small in terms of percentage change vis-a-vis what San Francisco is. But if you look at the names on the far right-hand side, Santa Clara, San Francisco, but also in Los Angeles, and also some rural places. So it's been a really mixed bag in terms of this migration question. And for economic and workforce development professionals, one of the key concerns, again, is how big a change is it going to be and what types of households are we gaining? Okay, folks, so one of the things to do is, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I'm going to wrap up now with some just simple things to look forward to. There has not been a lot of change in the economy or in the forecast. Right now, the recovery looks strong, and we should expect it to be. We had the third round of fiscal stimulus at the national level, which brought another fiscal policy punch to the equation. We've still got very low interest rates, and even though bond rates have crept up a little bit, they haven't crept up in such a way to undermine equity markets just yet. But rural areas of California tend to be recovering more quickly. So, for example, in Shasta County, where Redding is in California, they actually have very little change in labor force. They actually have an increase in retail employment, brick and mortar retail employment, 1 year on February 20 to 21, which means basically they have gotten through the initial stages of COVID-19 and have grown. This is also true for Napa County in California. And so you are seeing this small suburban rural California doing relatively well versus urban. Now, is that different than other recessions? And the answer is, it depends on which recession you look at. In the Great Recession, not necessarily, because a lot of rural California or small suburban California was exposed to housing risk based on how they grew over the first decade of the new millennium. But whether or not the rural momentum continues is a key thing going forward, and how much of it is bent on just the way that this crisis has unfolded. And once the recovery becomes stronger, well, we see the urban areas recover relatively quickly. My gut tells me, and at least my education tells me, that there will be really strong recovery in the urban areas once things get cooking. The key is whether or not people are going to continue to move around again, and whether or not they have to come back to the office. So that's really one of the major questions as we recover over the next 12 or 18 months, is how will our urban areas change as a result of how corporations look at workforce and their places of work and changing. So the three concerns at the bottom, if you're an economic or workforce development professional, are probably things to think about over the next year, though if you're coming again, I'll see you again in about a month. Locally owned business loss. Now that we're starting to see recovery, will that uncover the businesses that didn't make it more completely? And will it give it maybe a lifeline to the businesses that we almost lost, but basically are going to make it through? We are getting slow creeping inflation, and that's starting to make people a little nervous. So we learn in high school and in college that when fiscal policy and monetary policy are both working in the same time to boost the economy, the unfortunate trade-off of that can be strong inflation. And I've had a lot of people ask me about the early 1980s and if we're on a return for that. Well, the inflation at the end of the 1970s and the early 1980s was not the genesis of fiscal and monetary policy working together to boost an economy that was in recession. It's a long story, but in the end of the day, it was really kind of what you'd call a monetary experiment that failed. But regardless, the idea is we have to expect there to be some upward pressure in prices. If you look at the gas pump, for example, people tend to use that as a gauge. Gas prices have gone up, no doubt about it. They had gone down on the oil markets, and gas supply had been metered in such a way to sort of hold prices steady in the hope that we were going to get back in our cars relatively soon. We should expect pretty high prices by the end of summer this year, especially if people get out and want to get out of their houses hard, driving around all over the place. Will that change inflation? Generally speaking, it shouldn't, because we usually look at core inflation. But for lower to middle income workers, gas prices rising is like a regressive tax, and that's something to watch for in social policy circles. Is that going to be another blow to our lower and middle income households? One of the things to watch as we move forward toward fall and winter is, will we get a variant that upsets the apple cart in terms of recovery and leads to more nasty social policy? We will see, but watch for that. And it's probably going to be tricky over the next few months because we're going to be in a natural decline time of virus, and also with everybody getting shots, will we see some more immunity? But a variant comes, that'll be the one thing right now that would slow down recovery otherwise, given everything else that's positive, is if we have social policy contract again for either the fear or the slowly increasing the rising cases. So when you look at Europe, you look at South America, it should make you cock an eyebrow a little bit as to what might be coming in the United States as we creep closer toward the end of summer. But for the next 6 or 8 months, things look good, and we need those 6 or 8 months to be strong if we want to get through this before 2022 or 2023, but we will see. So folks, thank you again for coming today. I know I've got some questions here in the chat and in the Q&A. From Mary, you said we will be facing a housing crisis again in 2 years. What did you mean, needing more or having too much? What I meant is needing more. So when housing prices go up like this, just like in every other market, demand exceeds supply. And if we felt like demand was exceeding supply in 2015, 16, 17, 18, and 19, we've exacerbated that by a slowdown in building permits and an increase in demand for houses for sale. Now, if we see rental vacancy rise, we may say, okay, well, there's our pressure release. The problem is that we were talking about a housing crisis with a lack of the availability of purchase previous. That's still going to be there. With the Richard asks, with the continued drought, will possible wildfires impact the California economy? And the answer is they might. I can't really say too much about how drought may affect the probability of major wildfire that isn't already there. But one of the things that certainly, if you start to stack things up of high cost of living, lack of economic recovery, threat of wildfire, perceived or real, drought, and how that might change agricultural outcomes, if you shove all that together, it definitely could slow down the movement of the California economy, or at least make it slower in recovery in certain circles than in others. There will be a copy of the deck. All this will be going to Chabin to get posted, and they will have the deck. Thank you, Troy, for asking that question. I do have one in the Q&A from Darren. Local governments are receiving millions of dollars in this latest stimulus package. How can they best deploy that money to help our local economy recover over the next year or two? That's an outstanding question. I think a lot of it is really probably going to be providing some social services to those that need it, and trying to, in a sense, stabilize the otherwise potentially mobile labor force. So one of the things you don't want to have in your local economy is a lot of people moving around and a lot of uncertainty of businesses of whether or not they're going to be able to hire back workers if demand starts to rise. This is especially true in small suburban and rural California if you haven't received more working families as new households. In urban areas, there tends to be a lot more, let's say, dynamics to the labor market because there's so many people. But in small suburban and rural California, it's a little trickier. So that's on the social service side, really trying to stabilize those low to middle income households that need the help, A, and B would be probably the first folks to be hired as we start to move through the next stages of recovery. That would probably be the first place. The second place is thinking about broadband infrastructure, and if you can partner up in such a way to provide more connectivity and really think about how to support folks that may be having a longer spell of unemployment in terms of their ability to turn around and start a business, or at least keep themselves connected. Folks, that looks like that is it. So thank you so much for coming today. I'm going to give you 7 minutes back, but there will be a recording of this and the slides up at Chabin. And folks, have a great month and week, and I will see you soon. Thank you.